In this chapter, students will draw and identify lines and angles, classify shapes by properties of their lines and angles, and identify lines of symmetry. In order to be successful with the new skills taught in this chapter, there are some prerequisite skills students will need to be familiar with. First, a basic understanding of both parallel and perpendicular lines. Parallel lines are pairs of lines that are always the same distance apart. Perpendicular lines are lines that meet at a right angle. This was identified by comparing the angle to something known with a right angle, such as the corner of a card. Second, students are able to recognize that all shapes with four sides, such as squares, rectangles, parallelograms, rhombuses, and so on, are also quadrilaterals. Third, understanding of congruence and equal parts in order to move on to the topic of symmetry. Look at these two shapes. These two shapes are congruent. Let's move on to geometric objects. Geometric objects refer to points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, parallel and perpendicular lines. A point is a position in space represented by a dot. A line is an object that is perfectly straight and extends infinitely in either direction. A line segment is a portion of a line that begins and ends with an endpoint or a piece of a line. A ray is a portion of a line with a specific endpoint that extends infinitely in one direction. An angle is the degree or amount of turn between two lines, line segments, or rays. Perpendicular is two lines, line segments, or rays that intersect at a 90-degree angle. And parallel is two lines, line segments, or rays that will never intersect. Students will be introduced to the naming convention for each of these objects. This geometric object is a line segment and is formally identified as line segment AB. Being introduced to the formal name will help students discuss each item with clarity. If I put up other geometric objects by stating line segment AB, it is clear to see which line segment I am referring to. The next concept and skill is geometric drawing using a protractor and straight edge. Students may think that a drawing can be created as a loose sketch and that they don't need to use tools or exact measurements. Although there are times when a sketch is appropriate, these geometric drawings must be created with precise measurements. A protractor allows students to create accurate drawings with precise angle measures. Let's use a ruler or straight edge to draw a line. First, draw along the straight edge. Then, draw arrows on both ends. Let's use the protractor to draw a right or 90-degree angle. Turn the protractor so that the line drawn in the previous step is at 90 degrees. Then draw a second line. Erase the extra markings. Students will also identify and describe right triangles. A right triangle is any triangle with a right or 90-degree angle. It is important that students do not assume that a triangle has a right angle. The angle must be measured to be 90 degrees or marked with a 90-degree mark. Students will use angle legs to create a variety of right triangles. Students will then discuss the feature of right triangles. The side opposite the right angle is always the longest side. The angles in a right triangle are always one right angle and two acute angles, and right triangles can never have three congruent sides or angles. Right triangles are the foundation shape of mathematics and are used in numerous applications throughout secondary mathematics and the real world. After students have learned how to measure angles, identify parallel and perpendicular, and recognize right triangles, they will create a chart describing two-dimensional shapes, like this one. Students will begin to notice that shapes can also be called different names. A square can also be called a rectangle, or a trapezoid, or a parallelogram, or rhombus, or quadrilateral. It is important to take the time to discuss each shape and the attributes that classify each shape. The next step will be comparing two-dimensional shapes. Students will be required to think about shapes by their most specific name. A shape with four congruent sides and four right angles is a parallelogram, but more specifically, it is a square. Students will use Venn diagrams along with the two-dimensional shape chart to compare two different shapes. For example, let's compare a square and a rectangle. Let's start by looking at the attributes of a square. There are four sides, A rectangle also has 4 sides, so this will be listed in the overlap because it is something they both have in common. A square has all right angles. So does a rectangle. This will go in the overlap. A square has 4 congruent sides. A rectangle does not, so this will go in the square-only portion. In this chapter, students will learn to use the formal definition of a trapezoid, which is a 2-dimensional figure with at least one pair of parallel sides. This inclusive definition allows that parallelograms and all of the subsets of figures, rectangles, squares, and rhombuses are also trapezoids. The next concept is symmetry. Symmetry is when one half of a shape is exactly like the other half of a shape. The lines where the two halves are distinguished from each other is called the line of symmetry. Students explore symmetry by folding shapes so they overlay perfectly. For example, fold this rectangle so that the rest of the shape perfectly overlaps itself. This fold is a line of symmetry. The rectangle can also be folded this way to create another line of symmetry. In this chapter, students will learn to draw and identify lines and angles, classify shapes by properties of their lines and angles, and identify lines of symmetry. It is important that this content be given practice and used in as many ways as possible. It is encouraged that students find opportunities to recognize geometry content across all subject areas and in the real world to develop well-rounded geometricians.